everybody. I'm going to tell you a story now. Everyone sitting comfortably? Yeah, good. This story is actually true, and it happened quite a while ago. So a long time ago, I used to have this guy called Philip. He used to come over to my house when I was a kid and babysit for me. And then one day, Philip stopped coming. And I didn't know why he'd stopped coming. And, you know, I was about 6 or something. And to be honest with you, I didn't even question it, because you don't when you're that age, do you? Really think about things like that. So it was just this woman, and I didn't think about it until one day I bumped into Philip's mum. So this was when I was about 30. And I bumped into Philip's mum. And she told me why Philip had stopped babysitting. So what had happened was, he didn't just babysit for our family. He used to babysit for a lot of families around our neighbourhood. So I grew up in North London, and there's also kind of big houses around there. And he was going to one of these big houses in North London, and the family were going to the theatre because it was Christmas. And it was living in the house, there was the mum, the dad, 2 little girls who would have been probably 3. And anyway, so he went around there and he went upstairs to the little girls' room, and they were just at that stage where they were having separate beds, and they were tucked up and they were asleep already. And the mum was kind of over his shoulder, and so he was like, well, good night, and good night. And he got out the very hungry caterpillar and he was going to read it to them. And the mum said, oh, you know, they're asleep, it's all right. And so he made sure the window was shut and the curtains were drawn because it was cold outside. And then he turned the big light off, and the night light, little orange night light, turned it on. And then he went downstairs. And the mum and dad said, okay, well, help yourself to anything in the fridge. We'll give you a call at the interval from the call box to make sure that everything's all right. Of course, a call box, yeah, because this is the olden days. Yeah, this is a long time ago, and this is before the days of caller display and hands-free. And sometimes I tell this story to young people, and they can't believe it. You know, when I tell them about this massive phone that you would have plugged into the wall. And of course, it was the days of extensions. So, you know, you'd have loads of phones all over the house. You know, like upstairs in your bedroom, if you're talking to your friend, oh, hi, yeah, I'm just going to the kitchen. Hang up, go downstairs. Are you still there? Because all the same line. Are you still there? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm going in the living room now. And so on. And anyway, I was telling this to a bunch of teenagers, and one of them goes to me, wait a minute, doesn't it mean that your mum could just pick up the phone and listen to you? My mum's actually here, and she will tell you that did happen, didn't it? I was on the phone to my friend, I was going, oh, I can't believe she's such a bitch. I can't believe it. And her voice, I can hear you. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah, so they said, we're going to the theatre. We'll give you a call at the interval to make sure everything's all right. And off they went. And so Philip sat himself down in the big brown armchair. And there was a big brown telly. And next to him, there was one of those tables that's got 3 levels. Do you know the kind of table that I mean? It's on the top, it had the phone. And then underneath that, it had a notebook with a pencil for the messages, because no answer phones. And then underneath that, it had magazines. And anyway, so it's like, turn on the telly, click. Telly comes on. And it was the news. So it's like, oh, that's boring. I'll just go and click. There's another news. So that was boring too. Turn it over. It's a documentary. It was boring. Well, that was that. 3 channels. Nothing on any of them. So get out the newspaper, magazine, starts reading it. And quite soon after that, the phone rang. Ring, ring. Ring, ring. And he's like, well, that's weird, because it's not going to be the mum and dad, because they're not going to have even got to the theatre yet. So, bring, bring. Maybe it's important. I better answer it. Bring, bring. And so he picked it up. He goes, hello? Voice on the other end goes, have you checked your children? And he slammed the phone down. And that was funny because, you know, in those days, people used to do pranks all the time of, you know, kind of dialing random numbers and ringing up and saying silly things, but something about that voice, he knew it must be a prank, but it really made him feel scared, really, really scared. And so he thought, I'm just gonna turn the TV back on. So he turned the TV back on, turned the volume right up. He was watching it, but he wasn't watching it. He was, I'll turn it up a bit more. Just stop being silly, I'll have a biscuit in a minute. And about 20 minutes later, phone rang again. Bring, bring. Bring, bring. And he thought, you know what? It could be important. Maybe there's a problem with mum and dad. Maybe I should bring, bring. So turn the telly off. He goes, hello? Voice on the other end goes, have you checked your children? And he hung up. And he was really, really scared. He didn't know why he was so scared. He was just really, really scared. What he wanted to do was call his mum, but his mum was out, no mobiles, so he couldn't call her. And so he thought, I'm going to get in loads of trouble for this. But I think I'm going to call the police. And even as he was dialing 999, he was thinking, they're going to be really angry with me for wasting police time. And he got through. And they go, fire, police, or ambulance. And he's like, oh, police, please. Putting you through. And he got through to the police officer, this woman, and she was really, really nice. She wasn't angry at all. She said, oh no, she said, that does sound scary, but I wouldn't worry. You know, it's almost certainly just someone pranking. You know, of course, you know, if you're in the house on your own, of course that's going to be a little bit scary, but you know, don't worry anyway. So you've given us your address and you've given us your name and you've given us the number that you're calling from. So if there's any kind of a problem, we put a trace on the line. If there's any problem at all, we'll just give you a call back and let you know. But I'm sure it'll be fine. Don't have nightmares. And he felt a lot better. So he's like, oh, thank you very much. And I thought, you know what? Just being silly. It's just a prank. Just turn the TV on. I was like, okay, this is quite a good program. I'm just going to watch it. And about 20 minutes later, bring, 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 bring. And he was like, well, it could be the mum and dad by now. It really could be them, so I better answer it. Hello? And the voice on the other end goes, have you checked your children? And Philip goes, who is this? Who are you? Why do you keep calling me? And the voice on the other end goes, and he slammed the phone down. And the phone goes, bring, bring. He's like, no way. Bring, 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 bring. it stopped. And then it started again. Bring. And he went, what? And it was her. The police officer. The woman. The really nice one. And she said, oh, hello. Am I speaking with Philip again? Yeah. Did you say you were downstairs? Tell me something. Can you see your coat from here? And he said, my coat? He said, yes. She said, I'd like you to do me a little favour. I'd just like to say really, really calm. And I'd like you to just go to your coat now and put it on because it's cold outside. And then I want you to just go outside and I want you to just wait for me in the garden. I'll be along in a minute. Just go outside and wait for me in the garden. Do you think you can do that for me? And he said, yeah. And so he went outside to go, went and put his coat on, and he went outside into the garden. And it was quiet out there. And he looked back at the house that he'd just been in, and he hadn't turned the light off in the room that he'd just come out of. So the curtains were drawn, it was brown. Yeah, he could see that light was on. And then he looked up to the window, the little girl's room, and where he had shut the window, it was now wide open. And where he had drawn the curtain was now blowing out. And where he had turned the nightlight on, it was now off. And at that exact moment, everything went crazy. There was fire engines, there was police, there was people in reflective jackets, there was people with walkie-talkies. They were going, it's upstairs in the little girl's room, send 4 men, it's upstairs. There's a boy in the garden, don't forget the boy in the garden. And this police officer, this woman, went up to Philip. She put her arms around him. She put a blanket over his shoulders. And she said to him, it's all right, you're safe now. And then she started leading him away. And she put her hand on his face like that so he couldn't look behind. But he looked anyway. And he saw the door was open and he saw coming down the stairs, he saw 4 police officers and they were taking they had a man between them. He'd been upstairs the whole time, calling from the upstairs. He was dressed as a clown. His face was all white. He had been upstairs the entire time, calling from the upstairs extension. And his hands were covered in blood. He saw as he went past. And that was why Philip never did babysitting again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We're going to be joined now by Javier and by Neil. And we'll, yes, well, there we go.
Oh, my own chair.
Yes. Please come up. It's been quite some time since I listened to a story told by another person with their whole body, with their voice, not just their voice, but with their whole body in it. I don't know about the rest of you, but it took me back to something quite interesting. You know, there's something very visceral about being told a story rather than, watching it through a little screen or reading. So if anyone does feel like they need a moment to think, we should maybe do that. But I, of course, would love to hear Neil and Javier what you think. I wrote down a couple of things, but I was sort of engrossed, so taking notes didn't feel sensible. I did write the phrase, "I'm sure it will be fine." I'm sure it will be fine. And listening to Liz and Anna and Kim and the rest of the session speaking, there was something very interesting about that phrase, "I'm sure it will be fine," where, real fear comes in almost in contravention to that phrase. It's not going to be fine. That's the essence of fear, isn't it? When something's not going to be fine. So thank you so much for doing that for us, Vanessa. Can we have another round of applause, actually? There are two things I was hoping to try and get to in this our session, and they really are horror and the brain, and horror and our culture. And that feels a little bit ambitious, actually, for the next 40 minutes. But I really do hope we can talk about some interesting stuff. And the first thing is a question that I actually wanted to put to Neil. What was happening in our brains whilst we listened to Vanessa just then?
I'll start with the easy one.
Yeah.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for staying, because the third instalment in the franchise tends to be the worst. So, here goes. The interesting thing about the brain and horror is there's very little research on how the brain responds to horror. It's very different to the brain's response to fear-related stimuli. And it all comes back to how we regard horror and the generation of fear from horror as opposed to real-life things. And there's a philosopher called Carroll who's made this distinction between real horror and art horror. Now, art horror, things, films that we watch or TV programs that we watch, or stories that we read or hear. Whereas the real horror are the real life traumatic events that probably cause PTSD. And those sort of things we try to avoid, and our body tells us to avoid those things because it's a survival mechanism. So, for example, if we're confronted with something that threatens us, or even we perceive it as being threatening, then what happens is the body starts behaving in an unusual way. The sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, so I'm getting a bit technical, but you're probably drunk, so it doesn't matter. So the sympathetic nervous system sort of kicks in, to use a phrase I tell my students not to use, and that is, your heart rate increases, the blood is sent to the organs that need it because the body's preparing itself for fight or flight. And normally flight is the more sensible option because then you won't get hurt. Now, we don't know whether that happens when we watch horror because horror is, if you like, it's, William Friedkin called it safe darkness. When we watch horror, it's a bit of what you're saying about, we're fine. We sort of are. And Virginia Woolf said something very similar, but she was talking about ghost stories, tying to what Vanessa was just performing. And she said it is sensible to feel fear, conscious that we're under no kind of danger. So it's like a safe fear that we experience. So this is a very roundabout way of saying, one, we don't really know what happens in the brain when we watch a horror film, but there is some research. And there's some research on brain injury. There's a very famous case study that Xavier will certainly know about, of a 44-year-old woman who had damage to both sides of the amygdala. For those of you who know your psychology or your neuroscience, or you don't know, the amygdala is a subcortical structure. So it's deep inside the brain. It's thought to be one of the brain regions that was sort of developed fairly early on in our evolution. And it has a myriad of functions, including monitoring the environment for threat. And it's also involved in lots of other things as well, like face perception particularly, and appetitive behavior like feeding and sex and hunger and so on, and being violent. If you remove the amygdala, then monkeys become just completely non-violent but highly sexual. So I wouldn't recommend it. Well, actually, maybe I would recommend it. I don't know. So there was this case study of a woman. The thing about bilateral amygdala damage, by the way, is that their perception of emotions is not the same as our perception of emotions. And they have extreme difficulty in perceiving fear and also experiencing fear. Something they have in common with people with damage to another part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which I might come to in a second. But anyway, back to the 44-year-old with bilateral brain amygdala damage. So a group of researchers wanted to see whether her response to horror would be different to an unbrain damaged individual. So what they did was they gave her clips from, I think, 10 video nasties to watch. And they took her to a haunted house. Which
doesn't seem very fair.
Well, it turns out to be quite fair, actually, because, haunted houses, depending on your view of haunted houses, people tend to be quite frightened of them. And if you're quite temperamentally spookable, then it's not a nice experience. We may come back to that because our response to horror is very much determined by our personality and peculiarly our sex, but we may come back onto that. So they had her go into this haunted house attraction, and gave her these 10 video nasty clips to watch. Interesting ethical approval process, this study. And what they found was something quite peculiar and unusual, and that is when she went around the haunted house, she thought it was fine. It was like, going around IKEA. Actually, IKEA is worse than going around a haunted house. And she would do things like, in a haunted house, or a ghost train is a better example in the UK, I suppose, because we have very few haunted house attractions. But on a ghost train, you've got people sort of, reaching out with their arms to sort of tickle you and sort of doing strange, things that would get you arrested outside the confines of a ghost train. So what they found was that when these people were doing all this palpating while she was going around the house, she would just giggle and laugh at them and sort of, call them names and often tickle them back, which is not the usual response in a ghost train. And then when she watched the clips, the horror film clips, they asked her, well, what did you think? Were you not alarmed? And she said, no, I thought they were quite funny. Which sort of, now, bear in mind, n=1 does not a body of literature make. And there's not very much literature, as I say. But it's interesting that this part of the brain that we know is involved in fear, in this one individual, made her respond to horror in a way that people who with intact amygdalae would not behave. So, in answer to your question, possibly the amygdala and also the prefrontal cortex, which we know in psychopaths is a part of the brain that is very irregular, possibly damaged, possibly lower in volume, which is why psychopaths are psychopaths. And by the way, folks, psychopaths are very rare. They're about 1% of the population. And people confuse psychopathy with antisocial personality disorder.
That would suggest there's likely, not quite, but there's one in this room.
Oh, I'm looking at one right now. Yes, you.
So thank you so much for that. Now, there was another word that I wrote down, and I think I want to pick apart what you said about fight or flight in relation to horror, but one of the other words I wrote down was anticipation. So I think, certainly as I listened to you, Vanessa, there was almost this like dial that was just ticking up and up and up and up and up. And I'm actually not sure whether it got sort of constantly more kind of uncomfortable and apprehensive and, or whether there was just the littlest bit at the end would have sent me over the edge, if you see what I mean. But what does that have to do, that feeling of anticipation, when we're coming across an obviously scary or horrific thing, but we haven't quite seen it yet? What does that have to do with the fight or flight reflex that we have?
I think it's the core of horror, and I think Vanessa did it brilliantly because, perhaps unwittingly, eyebrow goes up. You've illustrated, in fact, one of the two major theories of why we enjoy horror, why horror has its effect. I mean, there are lots of different theories, but there are two main ones. The principal one is the excitation transfer model. I know it's on the tip of all your tongues. The excitation transfer model argues that we feel engrossed by horror because of this increase in suspense. And the suspense does build up almost monotonically. But it gets to the point where you can't have too much suspense. There has to be a relief of that tension. Because if there isn't a relief or a resolution in film terms, then it carries on. And then that suspense turns to dread. And that's not a good thing. So in most horror films, you'll find that they will end with a resolution of some sort. Now, you probably know many films that don't end with a resolution. I mean, Halloween is obvious. The Omen is a very good example, as well. Basic Instinct, horror, but it ends on a sort of twist that makes you think, oh, it's not satisfactorily resolved because what we thought was happening isn't actually happening. So what Vanessa's performance perfectly illustrated was one of those main theories of why we enjoy horror. The other one is a bit more basic. It's called the uses and gratifications theory, which simply argues that we enjoy horror, we seek out horror because we like looking at these things because it satisfies a particular need to watch destruction or chaos or blood or horror and so on. So those are the two main
That's so interesting. So one of the questions that I had written down was, why is this feeling of thrill and satisfaction, why does it often feel so kind of closely adjacent to the feeling of fear? Is there something essentially in that it's gratifying, but why?
It is, and that's probably because the body is telling you to be afraid of it, because you're immersed in it. I mean, assuming it's a good piece of literature or film or whatever, if you're immersed in it, then you're involved in the storytelling. And that's exactly what happened with Vanessa's performance. You're completely immersed. And all those silences were brilliant, because you could hear a sort of pin drop during those hiatuses between, the next revelation or the next revelation. And there's also a connection between that and the typical jump scare that everybody knows about and the previous group talked about. And in psychology, there's always a technical word for something in psychology. We call it the startle reflex. Come on, Luke, don't do a mock.
Fair enough.
We invented it before the jump scare. But the idea is you can measure it in laboratory, and it's normally measured by eye blink response. So if you delivered, say, 50 decibels of noise for about 40 milliseconds, you'll blink. You can have visual stimuli doing this as well. Or you can have a puff of air, but that's a bit more mechanical. We know that if you do this, then it prepares people to anticipate fear. So I think it's sort of tied in. So these gaps where you think, I wonder what's going to happen. Or there's a bit of relief, something horrible didn't happen. It's a bit like the startle reflex in sort of minor form in a way. Because you're anticipating something that's going to happen, but it doesn't. But then the story continues, the tension builds up again, and we still feel that sense of anticipation. And what's going on in the body is probably heart rate deceleration, something's going on in the brain that we don't quite know about, and also other things like your galvanic skin response, which is your arousal response, which you can measure from your fingertips. That probably increases as well. People probably know that from the polygraph, which incidentally is useless. It doesn't measure lying at all, but it does measure arousal. And it measures arousal.
Good to know.
Say again?
Good to know.
Yes, I'm not lying. So it measures respiration, arousal, electrodermal arousal, and heart rate. And it does that really well. It doesn't measure lying very well. So all these things would be increasing while we were listening to Vanessa's brilliant story.
So I'd love to turn to Javi in a moment, but I had a question that was for you, Vanessa. And assuming you're not sort of too blinded by the spotlights as you look out whilst you're performing or telling the story, what do you see amongst the audience that gives you a sense of how they're responding? What are you looking for? What can you sort of read the feeling in the room?
So one of the things that I really notice if I'm with a group of teenagers or young people is that when it gets to the bit where he answers the phone, for example, I'll see them look at each other and go, just meet each other's eyes and be like, oh yeah. Like it's a sort of shared experience of like, I'm experiencing something, are you?
Right.
And the other thing is you sometimes see people do a face like this.
I was saying that.
Or like quite an upset face. And if someone comes up to you afterwards and they've got that face on, they need to be reassured.
Right. Well, so and just on that point, there was something, that story wasn't made from anything that we don't encounter almost every day. No offense meant, it was utterly mundane. It was like, it could happen to anyone. Anyone who's been in a home on their own can position themselves in that story and think, and that's where it really gets you. How much do you think about the sort of the relatability of the story? Because I haven't had the pleasure of listening to you to sort of say and tell any other stories. Are some of them quite sort of far-fetched and werewolves and Draculas and things, or are they built from that sort of stuff?
I think the key to any story being compelling, and this is including movies and literature as well, is that even if it's a far-fetched character, you still need to identify with them. So I think they were talking in the previous session about identifying with Frankenstein's monster. And, you need to, as the person who's presenting that piece of art, make it relatable so that the audience can feel along with whatever is happening.
Yeah. Well, so there was a really interesting note, again, as listening to Anna and Kim and Liz talk earlier, exposing the fears and the anxieties that they actually pertain to your real life that happens every day, but they might get sort of explained or symbolized in a way that's quite fantastical and far-fetched with a werewolf or, a blob monster. And that was actually something that we were talking about, Javi, a bit before. So maybe we could pivot to horror and culture, horror in our society, because you've got some interesting ideas essentially about the role that horror can play in a culture for helping us talk about difficult stuff. And I wondered if you could, explain a bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I go against the grain in a lot of these, talks about horror. I think horror is good for us, and I think that's why we find it in almost everything. Children love horror. It's a way of socializing children. It plays into things like regulating their emotions, for example, or life in general is regulated on a punishment reward kind of basis. So there's a lot of the cautionary tale to a lot of these. Now, some of these concerns, some of these fears are innate. So we are wired, for example, to respond to specific fears like ancestral predators like snakes or spiders. That's why you'll see them cropping up in horror a lot. But then there are acquired ones. Your story, Vanessa, had clowns in it. That's an acquired one. Now, no one should technically be scared of clowns. They were not created with that in mind. They were supposed to be something playful for children to engage with. You would get children with clowns. Now, fast forward however many years later, it being the highest grossing horror film ever, people then dressing as clowns to commit crimes. And it might be the clown, in particular, the criminal dressed as a clown is one of our biggest societal fears. It taps into notions of control and comfort, which I think are key to horror. And I think we all have that sweet spot, don't we, between what we find not scary enough. So, for an adult audience like this one, that might be watching children's horror films like Paranorman or Frankenweenie. It doesn't mean I love them.
Two of my favorites.
It doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't enjoy those films. Of course we enjoy them, but we might enjoy other things about them, like recognizing the citations in them or enjoying the narrative. I mean, one of the things I really enjoyed about your story is the way you told it. The narrative pacing, your mixing of humor in there to make me feel at ease, and then bang at the end, as you tend to get with horror. But then tone it up too much. I always think that it's hilarious that I think one of your colleagues called me the fear man before. I don't know if I am the fear man, but if I am the fear man, I'm a really bad one because I can't do horror houses. There is something about the violation of my private space that my brain just can't cope. It's just too much. I can't cope with it. And then, I think it's called the emotional brain, the animal brain kicks in and I have to get out of it.
So on screen as much as you like, audio, whatever, but being in a physical space that's really interesting.
But I guess that brings me on to the other element of horror, which is it's not just about emotion, it's about an expression of society. And, and this is also why horror traverses genres in a way. And we can find horror is, I like to call it the most honest genre because it's the one that deals with the dark side of our psychology. And life is not all beautiful and lovely. We all experience pain, we all experience loss and death, and that's part of what makes us human. We wouldn't be the way we are if we didn't have those things. And horror is very honest in lifting up a mirror and showing us those things.
Yeah. So it's been a good evening here at Tortoise when you've written something so profound as "Are we the monster?" But I think it's a good. I do think that's a good question. There was another thing I put above it that was mentioned in the previous session, and it's here now. I think the most terrifying things don't necessarily need explanation, or perhaps full exposition, if you like. They can have a bit of explanation, but they don't need to be fully. Once. I think, for example, Vanessa, in your story, if we'd learned the name of the person and how long they'd been there, and something would crumble away. Do you agree?
Yeah, totally. I think that as a storyteller, I'm always trying to get as quickly from A to B without any diversions, and I think that it's quite astonishing how much you can take away, and it still be powerful. And in fact. Last week I was telling a story in the woods. So we all went into the woods and we told the scary story. And I realised that I think I was the only person who actually followed the plot in the whole thing, because it was just like a series of kind of scary episodes that were kind of linked together, but it was still, I could see that people were still satisfied by it. And in fact, that gap of knowledge is actually almost that missing piece is almost the thing that makes you feel unsettled. Because once everything's explained, you don't feel unsettled anymore, do you?
Yeah. Neil, what do you think might be, going back to what you were saying at the beginning about the instincts that we have? There's actually, fear can serve a purpose. Surely some of that is about how we deal with uncertainty, because as Javier's just mentioned, the predatory animal is most dangerous when you can't see it. We'd actually rather be able to see the animal. At least then you've got a chance. But when you can't see it, what's going on in our minds when the animal can't be seen, the beast isn't in our view?
Yeah, I mean, the animal example is a good one. I mean, Xavier mentioned the preparedness hypothesis, it's called. This idea that we're evolutionarily disposed to fear certain animals, which explains some, I think, fear, but it doesn't explain all, because there are some animals that we are afraid of that we would never have experienced in any part of the geography that we would have evolved from. Things like, large snakes. Well, actually not snakes. Snakes is a bad example. But some creatures that we are afraid of, we would never have encountered, and yet we do feel afraid of them. I think what this, shows is, and I think there's a film that demonstrates what you've just said very well, and that is the Blair Witch Project. Because in the Blair Witch Project, you see absolutely nothing. Well, it's dark, but you see absolutely nothing that is horrific. And even the end isn't that horrific. It's just very surprising. For those of you who haven't seen the Blair Witch Project, no spoilers. But what you see there is a Lovecraft called it Lovecraft said the strangest fear of all is the fear of the unknown. And things that we can see, we can sort of deal with, sometimes badly, sometimes well. The things that we can't see and that we may imagine or fantasize about, that will cause greater fear. And then you have all the bodily responses, becoming present. Say, for example, you're alone at home at night and it's dark, you're in bed, and all of a sudden downstairs you hear a crash, which you suspect may be an intruder, possibly. Could be a cat, could be just a vase dropping, who knows? But automatically you're thinking, what is that? What is the threat to me? And as a result of that, your body then starts to determine that the right way of responding to what you've just heard is this particular form of action. So, you're right. You don't need to see things to be afraid of them. But if you can see them, it's easier to deal with because you have to.
Yeah. There was something quite interesting about the clips that we watched and the differences between them. So there were some that were in that period of uncertainty, that building, like we were describing, where the dial is rising. And then there were others that went into the bit where, the dial's going crazy and you see the thing. You see what has been there to terrify you throughout. But for me, I think it loses some of its power in that moment. And there was something I was thinking as you were telling your story, Vanessa, which is you can't make loads of blood spew out of something, and you can't make a visually terrifying thing appear unless you can project that into people's minds. But actually the art that I saw you doing was, you didn't need that. You didn't need the gore or the menacing sort of visceral thing. It was all about the pacing. And I wondered, what's your sort of inspiration? Where did you learn to think about it in that way?
Well, thank you. So first of all, I think I've read a book where they distinguish between horror and terror. And horror is like the sort of gore and the person cut open. And terror is that feeling of anticipation and dread. And I think it's really important to distinguish between those two experiences. As a storyteller, quite a lot of people don't, they'll say, I'd like a horror story. Can you come and tell a horror story for our thing? But then, our party or something. But then they would expect me to talk about someone getting cut open and all their guts getting spilled out and something like that. And it's just not very powerful on its own. It's only powerful as part of something else. It's powerful because it plays into that idea of us being terrified that could happen to us or our loved ones. So it's only really powerful in context, these kind of gruesome horrific things. We do use them in storytelling as well.
Yeah.
But it's much harder. I couldn't describe what happened on the screen of any of those horror films and it be at all interesting or compelling.
I find that so interesting. One of the things that you mentioned before, just because you were using the word there, Vanessa, the power of horror. Something quite intriguing about, the power of horror to explain things that are actually problematic in our society, things that we're struggling with. It made me think of Jordan Peele and Get Out. And so I wonder if you could just sort of gloss that a little bit, and particularly because you've worked, I think, with respect to Spanish horror films.
Yes. So, I mean, the other thing that fascinates me about fear beyond how it works, for all the reasons that we've mentioned, is what it does. And I think the reason that horror is a genre, I mean, I think it's both a genre and a mode of discourse, as Kim Newman said, because we can find it beyond that genre. But as a history of the genre, we can find patterns that remain the same. So, the startle effect hasn't largely changed in 100 years. But what has changed is what scares us. And more importantly, what those monsters, those things that scares us, mean. And that means that because monsters are receptacles of social anxiety. And so it is fantastic to me, and this is a particularly exciting time to be researching horror, because finally those voices that we haven't always heard in cinema, which has been primarily white male kind of genre, now we're hearing female directors writing very specifically feminist films. I mean, Ginger Snaps is a good example. It wasn't directed by a man, but it was either co-written by a woman. It's very much a film treasured and loved by female horror fans, because it talks about the process of being a teenage woman, and especially that entry into the adult world, the socialization of the woman so well. There are so many films from the 70s where that kind of monstrous feminine comes through as well. The Brood, for example, being one of them, or Carrie, The Exorcist. They're all concerns about the body of women. And to go to Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta and Brian Jenkins and all these exciting African-American directors, again, that's a way of turning a mirror to horror and what horror has left behind. The horror of Get Out is not just the objectification of the African-American body in the States, is even the white liberal discourse, the I would vote for Obama a third time kind of horror that comes through in the film. No one white in that film is a source of anything but discomfort. I find that terribly exciting, and it's what I think makes horror a genre that stayed, whilst others, maybe like the Western, which don't really speak to those historical archetypes, have kind of disintegrated and become other things. Horror remains pretty much unchanged in what it does. It just adapts to whatever concerns are happening.
So I'm unusually excited about the phrase "monsters are receptacles of social anxiety." I just think that's brilliant. Could you explain a bit more of what you mean by that?
Of course, a monster is nothing. A monster is fear of the other. Ultimately, it's whatever we project outwards socially. So that can be a gender type of abjection. I've talked about the bodies of women. It can be queer bodies. Anything that isn't the white nuclear heterosexual person. It can be the racial or the immigrant other. We push all these social fears about what is not us, that which we fear, onto what we don't know. And that changes, that never stays stable. So it makes sense, as Kim Newman was saying before, that we encounter a Dracula in the 1930s that's kind of like a suave, aristocratic character. We have very different types of vampires and zombies now. We have come to empathize and even understand the monster as ourselves, because we understand this notion that there is no such thing as a normative or normal body. We all are freaks in some way or other by virtue of our gender, our sexuality, our race, our class. And I think that's what I find so interesting about horror. It taps into that and it throws it back at you.
Yeah. That's just brilliant. So I'd love to draw the three of you back actually a little bit into the conversation we were having previously to ask, what are the films or the pieces of media that you really, you feel strongly are great examples of horror? And I don't know if it's stories, Vanessa, for you, but what would you have said had you been sitting here, an hour ago in the other panel?
I think The Shining, probably. Because what I find most unsettling about that is the fact that it doesn't quite make sense to me. So, for example, I know that Kubrick designed the sets so that they didn't make geographical, logical sense. so that as you were walking through, you'd go into a room that couldn't exist and stuff like that. And I just find all that kind of stuff incredibly unsettling.
Yeah. What about you, Neil?
I'm actually thinking of The Shining. Did anyone see on Twitter today, somebody tweeted a mock trailer of The Shining, like a rom-com? There was a phase where people would do this in the early days of YouTube. I'll retweet it later. So if you want to at that Neil Martin, I'll retweet. It's really very well made, and you can see The Shining in a completely different light. It's interesting. Vanessa was talking about difference between terror and horror, and that was a distinction made by Carroll, who's the philosopher that I mentioned earlier, and he argued that horror has to have a supernatural or sci-fi monster. And terror was something different. So he would regard Psycho not as a horror film, but as a terror film for that reason. And there's a huge debate about, whether that's true or not. So best film. Oh, I've got a huge list, but I'll give you the one that I think is the best horror film, going back to the discussion.
Go for it.
And the one that always frightens me whenever I see it on telly. And I will watch it whenever it's on telly, even though I know what's coming. Honourable mention to Blair Witch Project and Host. By the way, Jed Shepard and Rod Savage and Gemma's film, which I think is brilliant. And I think they owe a debt to, the scariest film I know is Paranormal Activity, which is the Oren film, because, have you seen it? So you know the scene with the door, where the door opens and then shuts? And it's a beautiful build-up of tension to that point, because you think, what is going to happen? And the tension carries on. It's almost dread. At the end, because you think, this is not going to end. And please, something happened. Please let a vase fall or wet the bed, something. So then something happens at the door, and it is genuinely, you get what's called, physiologically, it's called pilorection, or there's an even better word, steady, there's an even better word for it, Luke, which is horriliction, appropriately, which is the goosebumps. Your hair stands on end, and that is the only film where, however many times I see that scene and those collections of scenes, has that effect on me. So that's the most frightening film. The best film came out in 1973. Any guesses?
Wicker Man.
76. Wicker Man, bit earlier. Not Suspiria, earlier.
Climax. The Exorcist.
I thought you might say The Exorcist, because The Exorcist came out in 73. It's not The Exorcist. I think the best horror film ever made is a film that came out in 73. It stars Vincent Price as Richard Lionheart, a Shakespearean actor, and it's called Theatre of Blood. And if you don't know it, find it. It's free on YouTube. I shouldn't be saying that, but it is. And Vincent Price plays a ham Shakespearean actor who is disregarded and disrespected by the critics' circle of London, and he fakes his own death because he doesn't get an award. He goes to a younger actor. He fakes his own death in this penthouse, which was later became Jeffrey Archer's penthouse, by the way. Oh, it's all horror this evening. And he comes back to life. He's saved by a group of vagabonds and meth drinkers. And he comes back and he enacts his revenge by enacting scenes from Shakespeare's plays. So he kills off all the critics using scenes from Shakespeare's plays. And Kim was talking about, his formative film. For me, it was watching Theatre of Blood as a double bill on a Saturday night on BBC Two. There is one scene with Robert Morley and two poodles and two pies that has to be, and a plunger, that has to be seen to be believed. So if you haven't seen it, don't watch it and then tell me what you think on Twitter.
Excellent. Javi, I'll leave the last one to you.
Sure. It is almost carry-on kind of like territory, that. Can I have two?
Of course you may.
So the formative one, we were talking about fear of clowns or coulrophobia. The one that made me a coulrophobe was the TV adaptation of Stephen King's It in the early 1990s. I don't know if you've seen it. I hadn't seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I think if I had seen it before then, I wouldn't have reacted quite so badly to Tim Curry in the Pennywise makeup. But I spend years, I probably still do check under my bed to make sure that there isn't a Pennywise is trying to sell me a balloon and telling me that we all float. The one that got me as an adult, and I'm not just saying that because it's a Spanish film, but I do love found footage. I love the kind of immersive nature of it. I also think it's the kind of cinema for the surveillance age. It's Wreck. It's a film that absolutely scared the bejesus out of me. I think the reason they probably had to do an American remake is because there's something that's quite lost when you read something on screen. feeling when you're reading the subtitles, and it's a film that's so immersive. It's about, where the camera's pointing your eyes at, that it doesn't quite capture it with the subtitles. So if you are going to watch it, the subtitled American edition is awful. The voiceover is terrible, but watch it that way because you'll have something closer to the original experience that I had. I was terrified by that.
Tremendous. Well, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. My head. Honestly, and I was talking about this earlier. It's the thing. I'm going to tell you the thing that terrified me the most and shaped my whole attitude to horrific content. It's the music video for Michael Jackson's Thriller, which I was shown at a Halloween party that my older sister had, not me. I was allowed to go, and all the older kids were allowed to watch Thriller, and it did me in. So that's mine, and I've never watched it since.
John Landis, of course, who directed American Werewolf in London.
Okay.
Another fantastic horror film.
Well, I will say my head is sort of absolutely swimming with extremely interesting ideas, and I hope everybody else is going to leave this with a sort of renewed hunger to learn a bit more about horror, and the people who've come to this as experts or enthusiasts. I hope it's been thoroughly interesting. It's just left to me to say thank you so much to Vanessa, to Neil, to Javier, to everybody else, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah.